Hey, everybody. It's Monday. That means it's time to be with Kevin, except, well, if you're following along in your program, I wasn't here last week because I was with clients all day and wasn't able to do it, but I'm glad to be here with you this week. And next Monday, I'm going to be with you twice. So mark your calendars. More about that later. I'm so excited that you're here. I've got to pull something up so I can be accurate here. So glad that you're here. We'll get started with the podcast itself here in a second. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're joining us and you've been here before, we're glad that you're back. Just say hello in whatever channel you're in. I can see those comments. So say hello. Tell us where you're from. We'd love to know that. Don't be shy, right? And so that's, I think, all I'm going to say before we count down and actually start what will become the recording for the podcast. And then I'll bring my guest in just a second. Okay. So Marissa, when we get to that point, we're going to do the podcast in 3, 2, 1. It's one thing to say you want your people to grow. It's hard to argue with that idea, but is that just a nice to have, or is it a business imperative? Today, we're going to talk about smart growth, growing your people with the goal of growing your company or organization. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you are here live, we hope you will say hello. Tell us where you're from. And while you're here, I want you to imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. Share your questions, your comments, and your ideas. They'll make for better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode too. Now, if you're listening later, you can still imagine you're having that cup of coffee with us. You just can't ask any questions. And you could be here live with us in the future for future episodes because you can get all of those and interact with us by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. And today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each masterclass is designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you my guest. This is one of those guests that really, for many people, won't need an introduction. And I see that there are comments over there. I'll get to all those in a minute, everybody. I am so glad to have Whitney with me. She and I haven't been together virtually in a very long time. And so before I do all that, let me just be official and tell you who our guest today is. Her name is Whitney Johnson. She is the CEO of the tech-enabled talent development company, Disruption Advisors, an Inc. 5000 fast-growing private company in America. In 2021, she was named number 8 on the Thinkers 50. If you don't know what the Thinkers 50 is, it's a list of the 50 leading business thinkers in the world. Number 8, everyone. She is an award-winning author, a regular keynote speaker, and a frequent lecturer for the Harvard Business School's corporate learning group. She is a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review and the MIT Sloan Management Review. Author of several top-selling books. They're all on my shelf, including Disrupt Yourself and How to Build an A-Team. And her latest book is part of the reason we're here today. Smart Growth, How to Grow Your People to Grow Your Company, as I promised you. She's also the host of the popular Disrupt Yourself podcast. She's had all sorts of really, really cool people there. And I'm so glad that she is our guest today. Whitney, so glad to have you. Thanks for being here.
Kevin, thank you for having me.
We got people saying hello from New Jersey. I'll just show some of these. We've got New Jersey, and we've got Michael in New York City, and we've got lots of thumbs up. We got the Bay Area where I used to live. Let's see what we got. Bangladesh. I'm not going to get them all. There's a whole bunch of them here, but we're so glad that all of you are here wherever you're coming from. So Whitney, you and I both do podcasts, and I'm guessing you have some questions you like to sort of regularly ask. And I have one that I like to regularly ask, and I'm going to start there because I actually know a bit about your backstory, and you've written about it often, but people here might not know. So one of my questions I like to ask is this. So tell us about your journey. You didn't go to college thinking you'd be doing what you do today. Like, how do you very briefly, because I think it also informs the topic of the day. Tell us just a little bit about your past.
Yeah, in 30 seconds or less, right?
Yeah, well, I'll give you 45.
Oh, thank you. All right. So my journey is that, as you hinted, I studied music in college. and had the plan. I don't know what I was going to do, but when I graduated, I went to New York. We needed to put food on the table because my husband was getting his PhD at Columbia, and New York is an expensive city. I started working as a secretary and eventually had a boss who believed in me, which allowed me to move from being a secretary to an investment banker. I then became an
By the
equity.
way, that's enough of a story of itself. You've
Right.
got like 3 life stories here, Whitney. Like
Yeah.
that's enough. I don't know
Yeah.
what instrument you played or instruments you played, but somehow you go from being a secretary to an investment banker.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. And so a boss who believed in me, which allowed me to become a banker. I then was disrupted because my boss, not that boss, but another boss got fired and they didn't know what to do with me. So they moved me from banking to equity research because I happened to be pregnant at the time and also had good performance reviews. I did equity research for about 8 years, 9 years, then discovered The Innovator's Dilemma, written by Clayton Christensen, disrupted myself, left Wall Street, became an entrepreneur, eventually worked with Clayton, co-founding the Disruptive Innovation Fund. And then in 2012, and I think this is when you and I first probably connected, I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review titled Disrupt Yourself, and have for the last 10 years been building this tech-enabled talent development company. Oh no, I lost you. See,
No,
maybe
I'm here. Sorry.
you're
Just
pulling me off the
momentary.
thing because I went too long. And so I'm now working, and we help people think about what growth looks like for the individual, because if you can grow your people, you can grow your company. And so that's how I got from music to the conversation that we're having right now.
And all of that is related to the core idea in the book. And really, I think, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think the core idea of your work, which is the SCurve, where you talked about Clayton and the SCurve. The SCurve isn't your initial idea, but I think you've added richness to it and put it in new ways that no one else thought about before. So for those who don't know, tell us very quickly what the SCurve is, because it's sort of really going to inform the rest of our conversation.
Oh, I love how you're giving these little tags so people know where we're going. Yeah. So I initially thought that my work was going to be about disruption, about disrupting yourself, and realized that that was actually the mechanism for what we're about to talk about, which is the SCurve and growth. And so as I was investing with Clayton and with his son, Matt, we were using this SCurve that was popularized by Everett Rogers back in the 60s, to help people figure out how groups change over time. And basically he said it's in the shape of an S, that initially growth and adoption of a new idea or product is quite slow. And then you reach a tipping point, which we all know Malcolm Gladwell wrote about, and you enter hypergrowth, and then at saturation, growth tapers off. Well, the big aha for me was that as we were using this to invest, was that this could also help us understand not only how groups change, but how individuals change, that we could use the SCurve to map what personal and individual growth looks like. And as you said, I have spent the last 10, actually more than 10 years now, really thinking about how does this apply to the individual and how can we use it to understand where we are, because if we know where we are, then we know what's next. So that's the SCurve at a high level. We can go into more detail, but that's the genesis of it.
I'm going to try to show people, if you're watching. Now, if you're listening, there we go. If I can go the right direction.
Yep,
there you can see the curve. This is
Mhm.
from one of the chapters in the book. Now, for those of you that are listening to the podcast, you don't get this view, which means you can always go to remarkablepodcast.com and watch if you need to see the SCurve, or you can just go buy a copy of Smart Growth. And you see
Very
multiple pictures of the SCurve. So you talk about, and you said it in short. We've got the start, which it takes us a long time to make a lot of growth. Then there's the hyper growth stage, and then there's the flattening at the end. And you just said that at some level that there are 3 stages for growth and learning. But I'd like you to talk about those 3 a little bit more, because you've actually put some words around some spaces inside of the curve. But just talk about those a little bit more. Like in context, we recognize, well, when I first start to learn something, it takes me a long time to make it seem like I'm making any progress. And then, wow. And then is anything going to happen? But like to talk about that a little bit more for us. Because then I want to get us thinking about how we can apply it personally.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So as you just said, there are 3 phases. And as it says on the banner of the thing, there are 3 phases of growth. And so here's what's happening in your brain. whenever you start something new, your brain is running a predictive model and asking itself, what do I need to do to get to the top of this S curve? I'm at the base of the mountain. What do I need to do to get to the top of the mountain? And at the launch point, so this is the first phase of the curve, it's making lots and lots of predictions, many of which are inaccurate. And so your dopamine drops, and that's the chemical messenger of delight. So you're de-delighted. It's not very fun. Your brain is also saying, I've never seen this mountain before. I've never seen this base camp before. And trying to map this all out. So it's cognitively very taxing for you. And you've got an identity shift that's taking place because you're not who you were and you're not yet who you're going to be. And so you're in this place of, I don't know who I am, which is very uncomfortable. So what's happening at the launch point of the curve is growth is happening. In fact, there's a lot of growth happening, but nothing's yet apparent. It's exhausting. You don't know where you are. There's identity shift. And so growth feels slow. And that is why it's very hard to start something new, because you're having all of those experiences of overwhelm, discouragement, frustration, impatience. So that's
I'm
the
never
first.
going to be good at this, Whitney. Like,
That's
how can I
right.
ever possibly be good at
That's
this? Like,
right.
all the stuff is happening inside, and it's just so unapparent to us that I love that word. We become de-delighted. Well, I don't really love the word, but I think it sounds cool. We become de-delighted. We are frustrated. We are emotionally spent. All
Mhm.
that stuff, right? A lot of this happened to people early in the pandemic. We
Yep.
figured out we were going to have
Right.
to work in different places. We didn't really know how to do it. And the first 2 or 3 weeks, it was okay because we had an adrenaline rush and like, we will figure this out. And then it got really hard for
Mhm.
lots and lots of people and lots of teams, sort of all at once, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically, when the pandemic came, we were all on an S curve, the pre-pandemic S curve, and then we were pushed off the S curve. And one of the challenges was is that we were all at the launch point of the curve all at the same time, which was very, very challenging. And you just said something else that I wanted to pick up on. So one of the things that also happens is the older we get, the more we can insulate ourselves from ever doing anything new. And so we can get very out of practice of being at the launch point, very out of practice of being uncomfortable. And so that's another thing to be aware of. And one of the benefits and boons of the pandemic was it got us flexing that muscle again of, okay, I'm doing something new. And us realizing that in fact, we could be very capable and competent in doing new things, which is why right now people are calling it the great resignation. I think it's more the great aspiration of us realizing I want more out of my life and I think I can have something better. And I know how to navigate a launch point because I just did. So those are the experiences.
Yeah, I like to call it. We're in the same general vicinity. I like to call it the great reflection, right?
Mhm.
Because this is a chance to step back. But this is also why we figured out. Oh, we have time, but we might be able to do something new. So we all started baking bread and
Right.
doing jigsaw puzzles and a whole bunch of other stuff that some of
Mhm.
us had never done or hadn't done in forever. And the other thing that I love about thinking about the Launchpad is the idea of kids,
Yeah.
right? Uh, Kids have got that muscle figured out.
That's
And
right.
one of the things that makes us adults, right? I always say that adults are just kids in big people bodies, but we've forgotten how to
Mhm.
flex that muscle. We've lost confidence in it, all that, which to me, that's one of the other things that I hear people saying all the time about when they're in the launch pad. It's like, I'm never going to get this. I've never been any good at that.
Mhm.
Right.
Right. For the last 2 days since they tried it.
Well, and it's like my dad used to say, always and never, Kevin, are a
Uh-huh.
long time, right?
Uh-huh.
So like I've never been able to do this. Like
Mhm.
until
Mhm.
today, like why not? Right? Why not
Right.
tomorrow?
Right.
But then we get out of the launch pad and we get into this the upward slope of the S curve.
Yeah.
And what's going on for us then?
Yeah, before we do that though, so did you start baking bread and doing puzzles?
Well, I no. I did not bake any bread, but bread was baked in my house.
Oh, there you
And
go.
yes, we did do some jigsaw puzzles. I grew up liking to do them, and it's sort of like
Mhm.
I guess it was okay to do them again or something, right?
Yes, yes. Members of the Eikenberry household did bake bread, and
There
bread
was
was consumed.
bread
Bread
baked and
broken.
broken, but it wasn't by Kevin. It was
I
enjoyed by
love it.
Kevin.
Consumed by Kevin. All right.
Exactly.
So you now you have the sweet spot. So you've baked the bread. You haven't baked it, but you've started learning how to bake bread, and you move into the sweet spot. Here's what's happening in your brain. Your brain is continuing to run that predictive model, and your predictions are becoming increasingly accurate. And it is thrilling. And what's happening is that you're getting lots of upside emotional surprises, lots of dopamine that's saying, yep, this is working, this is working. And you just think, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. It's still hard, but it's no longer too hard. And it's a lot easier, but it's not yet too easy. And so this is that place. Sometimes people talk about flow. Well, this is that place where you're feeling flow, this place of optimized tension. And here, from an identity standpoint, you're becoming who you're going to be. So you're starting to feel like you can inhabit, you're starting to figure out how to bake bread and feel like, yeah, I'm going to be able to get this. You're also not mapping quite as much new, like you've started to get the lay of the land. And so your brain's not quite as exhausted as well. So this is the place, is that steep part of the curve where you say, or where you recognize that growth not only feels fast, it is fast, it's just feels really good. And so that's the sweet spot of the curve.
Okay, can I stop you right there for a second? Because some
Absolutely.
people are listening saying, fast but not too fast, it feels really good. Always, like, because we're all dealing with so much change, not necessarily in our own, in our own growth, but like so much change all around us, and there is this speed thing. So talk a little bit more about that. Like, I'm with you, and I've read the book and I understand what you're saying, but when people hear that, what you just said, talk a little bit more about that speed piece, because there's a lot of people talking about that speed and rapid rate of change is what's causing so much angst, frustration, mental unhealth, etc.
Yes, it's a great question. So what I would say, let me back up for a second to answer that. If you think about your life, and the S curve becomes a fractal. So your life is an S curve. Your career is an S curve. Every job you've ever had is an S curve. Every role you have is an S curve. And so your life, as it's constituted right now, is a portfolio of S curves. You've got your parenting S curve. You've got your work S curve. You've got your church S curve, or your hobbies S curve. A number of different S curves. And so it can be that, for example, because of COVID, you feel like, wow, I am so on the launch point when it comes to where, when, and how I work. In that instance, one of the things that you want to recognize if you're dealing with COVID is you may not want to decide. The other day I was talking to someone, his wife was about to have a baby. He had just started a new job. He had just started a podcast. He was like doing 4 new things all at once. And so one of the things you want to say to yourself is, all right, I'm dealing with COVID. I'm at the launch point because of this. What kinds of curves do I need to put into my portfolio where I'm in mastery? And we'll talk about that in just a second, so that as a portfolio, you still feel like you're in the sweet spot, even though there's some parts of your life where you absolutely feel like, whoa, this is going so fast. So for example, one of the things that we started doing during COVID is, as a family, we're all here working, trying to figure out all the work piece. Well, every single night we would have things that as a family we would do. We would eat dinner together. We would read a scripture together, and we would watch Korean dramas together. Those are all things.
Of course, those 3 things always go together.
Of course they do.
Sure, right?
And in the summertime, we would take a walk, right? So we would have these rituals. And what that was doing is that was allowing us to create some calm, to do some things that were anchoring us, to create some stability in our brain, so that it was like, okay, I've got that mapped, and I've got that mapped, and I've got that mapped. Now I feel like I can go ahead and do all of these uncomfortable things around work, etc. So that was. What are your thoughts when I say that?
Well, you just made a really, I just made an interesting connection in my head, and I'm going to share it with you all.
Please.
And it might not make any sense to anyone except me, but here it is. So for a long time, I have shared with and taught and encouraged people to think about working not just on your weaknesses, but also on your strengths. A whole idea of having learning goals and all of that, and the idea that we are excellent at something because of the strength of our strengths, not because of the absence of weakness, right? And so, but the insight that I just got is, and so I always say to people, work on weaknesses and strengths concurrently. This is what we're after.
Mm,
And what I just got from you is that ties to the S-curve, because if I'm continuing to work on stuff that even if I'm already in mastery, I'm really trying. It's not, I'm incremental growth, but those little pieces of growth are still huge in the big picture. But I'm working on things I'm comfortable with while I'm working on stuff I'm not as comfortable with.
that's right.
No, I don't know if that makes sense to anybody but Kevin, but it makes sense to me.
It made sense to me because what you're saying is that you're using them as to balance each other out. And so you're basically, so the metaphor that I would use, Kevin, um is as if you were two people. You're saying to yourself, okay, I'm at the top of a mountain right now. I've got these strengths where I'm at the top of the mountain. And so I'm going to go do these S-curve loops. And those S-curve loops are effectively the things that I'm not so good at, but are important to do. And I'm doing the work to bring them along, but I'm doing it from a position of strength because I'm already capable of getting to the top of the mountain. So I can come back down and bring other people along. So that's the metaphor that comes to mind as you describe what your work.
Yeah, and the other thing that I wrote down that I love is the fact that the S-curve is fractal, which means it's not just across the various parts of our life, as you said, but also within it, right? So, like, we can take you, who is truly at mastery level with the S-curve, and yet that there's more yet for you to learn there, even so, which is why there's another book, for example, right? So I love that because it gives us a way to stay on the path of growth, sort of in any area. I love
That's
I
right.
love that part.
Right.
So
And one other addition I would say is every day is an S-curve. And so if you think about it, you say to yourself, well, then I want to have most of my day where I'm doing things that I feel like I'm in the sweet spot, some of my day where I'm in mastery, and some of my day where I'm doing new things. And if I'm not doing anything new, then that's when time's going to go by really fast if you're not doing anything new. So, okay. See, we're going down the fractal. Should we go
that's
to
okay.
mastery?
That's okay. So, all right. So, I want to talk about, we've talked about this could be in various parts of our lives, but if
Yeah.
people want to take whatever S-curve in their life they want to think about, the question I would ask you is, any more you want to say to people about assessing where they are on the curve? Because one of the things that crosses my mind is that all of the research says, and I think all of us would recognize, that we're not very good at self-awareness.
Mhm.
And so what's your take on, or anything else you want to say about how we assess where we are on the curve? And what's the role of feedback from others related to that?
Yeah. Do you want me to do mastery really fast before I go into
Oh,
that?
yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, we
Okay,
can do
we'll
that
do
first.
mastery
Sorry.
really fast, and then we'll go to the assessment piece because we don't want to leave them on the cliffhanger. Okay, so mastery is the place where the model, you figured it out. The model's complete, and because it's complete, there's actually not very much dopamine. So this is the place where you've mapped everything out, the identity's complete, so now it's the status quo. So from that standpoint, it feels pretty good. So at the launch point, you had growth felt slow. In the sweet spot, it is fast and feels fast, and in mastery, growth is in fact slow. And so once you understand that entire growth cycle, then you can start to navigate and figure out what's next, which goes to your question about assessing where you are. So what I would say, a couple of things. Number one, when we talk to people about the S-curve and explain it, most people are pretty good about thinking about where they are. Um, they will, though, sometimes when they take our assessment, our tool, they will show up, and I'll give you an example, is people will show up in mastery, for example. And a couple of interesting things that happen here is you'll say, well, do you feel like you have figured out everything that you need to do to be successful in this role? And they'll say, well, I'm a domain expert. But are you aware of everything that you need to do to be successful in this role? Because that means it's not just you getting to the top of the mountain, but if you're a manager, it's your ability to bring everybody along to the top of the mountain. So sometimes people will present in mastery when from a role standpoint, their manager would say, I don't know that I think that you are in mastery, but it allows you to have a conversation. The other thing that I would say that where it becomes important is that if I have someone on my team and I think they are doing a fantastic job, oh, they're so good, they're in the sweet spot. and then they take this assessment and they are presenting in mastery and they say they're in mastery, that's telling me that they're bored and they're starting to not get motivated. And what's going to predict their behavior? Where I think they are or where they think they are?
Where they think, for sure.
And so the use of this tool is for you to be able to, the SCurve generally, to have the conversation about where do you think you are? Where do I think that you are? Because it's very visual and simple, but it also helps you catch early on, am I at risk of losing this person, either because they're going to leave or because they're going to start to underperform because they're bored. And so I need to ask them to leave because they're no longer the performer that they once were.
There you go. And then of course, if people are at the launching stage, launch pad, we've got to be really extra aware as the leader and the coach to make sure we're encouraging and we're showing them that we're seeing growth, even if they're not seeing it, and all of that. So
That's right.
there's a lot. Basically, everything I've put up on the bottom of the screen, Whitney, you and I could talk about for an hour, but
that's right. That's right.
We do any of that for an hour. But there's another big piece that I sort of what I promised at the open of this that we really haven't gotten at completely. And so, and it's I think one of the best parts of the book is this idea of how do we foster this idea and create culture around it. And we don't have time to unpack all of the great stuff in here, but are there a couple of things that you would say to people but while they're waiting for their book to arrive?
Yeah.
We're talking with Whitney Johnson, the author of the brand new book, Smart Growth, How to Grow Your People to Grow Your Company. We'll give you a link to it where you can find it in a second. A couple of thoughts for people about this.
Yeah. So the basic premise of this book, well, there's a number of premises. Number one is that the fundamental unit of growth in any organization is the individual. So if you grow yourself, then you're going to be able to grow your people, and then your company is going to be able to grow. So that's number one. Number two, there was a study that recently came out from Egon Zehnder that found that when they surveyed 1,000 CEOs and they asked those CEOs, do you believe that you need to transform yourself in order to transform your organization? And 80% of them strongly agreed, 100% agreed, 80% strongly agreed. But here's the number I want you to focus on. 2 years ago, prior to the pandemic, that number was only 26%. 26%. And so that's the bad news. The good news is that people now understand that if they will grow themselves, if they will disrupt themselves, if they will find ways to move up their S-curve of learning, they are giving permission to the people on their team to move up their S-curves of learning. And as everyone in your organization, yes.
And sorry if I can interrupt just for 1 second.
Please.
Not only are we giving them permission, but we're making it safe for them to.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And then if you're all growing, then you're going to be able to grow your org as well. So your question on fostering and building culture around it, let me tell you a story or give you an example that I think will illustrate that. So there's a company called Chatbooks. They turn Instagram photos into photo books. And they've been around 7-8 years. People really like to work there. And as a consequence, people weren't leaving. And it's not a super big company, under $100 million in revenue. And so we administered our assessment, and 3 of the 4 senior executives were presenting in mastery. Okay. So they're like, all right, so now we've got a challenge because these people are really good. We also know that if they start to get bored, then the culture can be toxic, because if people aren't growing, then they start to distract themselves by sabotaging the culture. So what happened then is, by having this S-curve as a language, here are 3 conversations that took place. The first conversation that took place with the chief marketing officer was, oh, now I understand what's going on. It's not that I don't like Chatbooks. It's not like that I don't like you, my CEO. I'm just not growing anymore. I need a new S-curve. And as they had this conversation, they realized there wasn't an S-curve for her at this company because it's not a big one. So she was able to leave and go be a CMO somewhere else. It was an amicable discussion because it wasn't personal. It was just, growth is an imperative. How are we going to grow? So she leaves, moves on, creates an opportunity for someone else. You have this culture and this perception that growth is possible. Example number two, president of the organization. He had been promoted to that role, but he was presenting and mastering. He'd only been in that role for less than a year. So what was going on? Well, as he started to look at it, he realized, well, the CEO promoted me here, but the CEO is still kind of on my curve. And so they had a conversation around scope and roles and responsibilities. Hey, CEO, I know my curve is really comfortable for you, but I need you to go jump to your own curve so that I have headroom on my curve. And they did that. And then that allowed him to feel like, okay, I'm not in mastery. In fact, I'm in the sweet spot. I've got a lot of upside, a lot of growth upside here. And then the third conversation, again, this all goes back to culture, this sense of people feeling like I have an opportunity to grow, which is a huge predictor of longevity in any organization.
Yep.
Third person, CTO, he stayed there, promoted someone into another role that took a lot of the stuff that he was comfortable doing, and he started doing some new things. That's uncomfortable. Oh, I'm not sure if I want to do that or not. This gave him the ability to talk out loud of, hey, everybody, launch point. I'm going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to be awkward, but that's what we do when we do something new. And by talking through it, he could take the shame out of it and the discomfort and allowed other people to grow. So this is how you can use it. It becomes a tool of retention. It becomes a tool that people can use to talk about their growth so that they can coexist and collaborate. And so that's how you can build around it.
I want to just add one more thing, and then we're going to move on. And that's the idea that if you're listening to Whitney talk about that, everybody notice that's so first of all, I'm guessing you would agree with me, Whitney. Tell me if you don't. That we're at our best as a coach when we're on an SCurve, when we're in the sweet spot, when we're moving and we're conscious of where we are and we're growing. And so when we're doing that and when we're vulnerable and when we're sharing and when we're using that language, what we're also doing is making it safer for people who are on the launch pad or in the early parts of the sweet spot to really experiment, try, make mistakes, because they see us doing it too.
That absolutely. And in fact, what I will say, Kevin, is that I remember when I first, decided to become a coach, I had someone who I trusted very much say to me, my mother, she said to me, if you're going to do this, you need to, you're going to coach around these ideas. If you're going to coach around growth and development, you must walk your talk. You have to. And so for us, sort of physician heal thyself, if we are not growing and developing ourselves as coaches, our lives start to become very inauthentic, and people will over time, it doesn't actually matter if other people figure it out over time. It matters to us because we'll know that we're living a double life.
Well, exactly. And oh, by the way, they will figure it out.
Yes.
Maybe not completely, but they'll figure out parts of it, and it won't work, and we will be less effective. So, before I sort of take us in around the final corner into some final questions, is there anything else we didn't talk about, Whitney, that you wished we would have?
Yes, there is. So I'd like to talk about the ecosystem, because we're talking a lot about personal growth and this idea of where are you on the mountain of your growth and making sure that you've got all the tools in your backpack. But there's something called the weather patterns, the ecosystem. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is it sunny or not? And we tend to think about, is the ecosystem hospitable to me so that I can move up the curve? But the thing that I want everyone who's listening to think about, who manages people or who interacts with people, which is all of us, is to recognize and ask yourself, what ecosystem am I creating for the people who are climbing their own mountains and their own S-curves? Am I sunny? Am I providing sunlight? Am I providing snow? What am I providing? And so I think that's the other thing that I want us to think about, is this notion of, we're focused on our own ecosystem, but we are creating the ecosystem for someone else. And are we making it possible for people to grow?
100%. People are watching us more than we realize, and that's making a difference. So how would you, if anything, how would you differentiate between ecosystem and culture? Or would you?
I wouldn't.
Okay. I kind of thought you were saying the same thing. I wanted to make sure. It was one of the things I thought about as I was reading the book as well. To me, they felt like the same. I love having another word. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
So awesome. Hey, I've got a couple of other questions that I like to ask everybody. And one of those is, and so we're done talking. Well, we're not quite done talking about the book, but almost. Like, Whitney, what do you do for fun besides watch apparently Korean dramas?
Yes. Yes, I play piano and I watch videos about tennis because I'm going to get better at tennis, and I read books.
Well, let me be clear that the watching of the videos about playing tennis is good, but it's better when we pick up the racket. Just to be clear, you're not really going to get better till you pick up the racket and hit the ball. Just saying.
I'm priming my brain for springtime.
Okay, all right. Well, that part's fair. I know that part is completely fair, and those days will be here soon.
Yes, they will.
That's for sure. So you mentioned it several times, and I know that this is true, that you're a reader. You just mentioned it as well. What's something you're reading right now that maybe people might want to know about?
Well, of course, I can't just tell you one book. So I'm reading this book by Brene Brown. It's
Yes,
really good. I'm reading.
So for those of you who aren't watching, I have to tell you, Atlas of the Heart, right? Atlas of the
Heart. Yeah.
Atlas of the Heart.
It's so good. I'm reading this book, High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. And on the fiction front, I just finished reading The Court of Thrones and Roses by Sarah Moss. It's a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. It's just delightful.
All right. So real quick,
yeah.
Any thoughts about reading fiction and nonfiction? Do you always have a mix? Like, what's your take on that?
Oh yeah. I read like 5 or 6 books at once. So I always have, I'm continually reading nonfiction books because that's for work related and development and growth. And then I read fiction for fun and escape.
All right. So Whitney, where can people learn more about you, your work, and the book? Where can people go?
Yeah. Probably the easiest is just to go to whitneyjohnson.com, and I answer. I like how you just put that up. And then you can email me at wj@whitneyjohnson.com. And then I have a podcast, Disrupt Yourself, and then you can buy the book on Amazon or local booksellers, wherever books are sold.
Or go to find out all of them right there, whitneyjohnson.com/books, I think.
There you go. Correct. Yes, that is correct.
Hey, before I let Whitney go, before I let all of you go, I've got a question for all of you. And that's the question I ask you every week. Now what? What are you going to do with this? What's the point of? There is no point of this, by the way. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, Whitney's more entertaining than I am, but the point is, entertaining is one thing, but we're here for more than entertainment. We're here for our own development. We're here for our edification, more than just our entertainment. And if we want to get edification, we have to create application, which means asking the question, now what? What am I going to do with this? What am I going to take from this? What am I going to do? Maybe I need, besides buying a copy of Smart Growth, what actions are you going to take from what you heard today? Maybe it was something about thinking about the various parts of your life and the SCurves there. Maybe it's about doing some assessment of where you are in a particular part in your life. Maybe it's about thinking about where do I want to launch on something new, whatever that might be. I don't know what your action is. What I know is that if you don't determine that for yourself, the value of this is greatly reduced. So Whitney, I want to thank you for joining me. It was such a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this and so glad that we could do it today.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
All right, everybody, that's another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You know what that means? We're done for today. But if you've missed any in the past, of which there are hundreds, you can go back into the archive, remarkablepodcast.com. You can tell a friend to join you next week, because there will be a next week, and we'll be back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.